Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Wisdom Through Bitcoin podcast, where we talk with Bitcoiners that took the orange pill a little later in life. Our aim is to learn how our guests became Bitcoiners, even though the broader world around them thinks Bitcoin is made up magic money and ultimately going to zero. My name is Chris Bobe, and I'm here with Stewart Noyce today. Welcome, Stewart. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'd love it if you could start us off by introducing yourself and telling us about the first time you heard about Bitcoin.
Thank you very much, Chris. So my name is Stewart Noyce, and I started my life as a computer scientist or a programmer, and was able to write a few interesting new things back in the '80s when people weren't yet really familiar with a lot of the software techniques, and so. At some point, I've realized, man, it would be great if we could figure out how to build these products better. So I thought I'd go back to business school. Well, that's not where you go to learn how to build great products, but it is where you go to learn about marketing and strategy and things like that. So I ended up in a job as product manager at Sun Microsystems. And Sun was really instrumental in driving the adoption of distributed computing technology during that time of the late 80s and early 90s. And I came on as a product manager for network computing, which meant building applications on top of this new technology called TCP/IP. And I found myself almost within 6 months as a spokesperson for the internet. And before there wasn't really a commonly understood internet in the sort of data center and enterprise space and commercial space. So I ended up becoming really an advocate for something that was essentially beyond kind of what computing was at the time. It was a way to interconnect people all across the globe. And you could really see it at the time, how big an impact it would have to have an internet, to have a network that anyone could connect to and anyone could start building upon. But I don't think I had any idea of what was about to happen, because within a couple of years, we had a browser, we had HTML, and all of a sudden we had an entire web. So over the course of then about the next 30 years, I've just been working on various aspects of distributed computing, and I eventually found myself at a party on Sand Hill Road about 6 or 7 years ago. And one of the people I remember from back in the Sun days looked at me and said, "Stewart, you need to look into the blockchain. That's where everything's going to happen." I'm like, this guy was right there, right, like a year before me. So I said, "All right, I'm going."
What year was that?
That was, I don't know, probably 2014, 2015. And I got into, I started paying attention, but I couldn't wrap my head around it at the time. It just wasn't it wasn't top of mind for me, and I had other things to work on. So I ended up going back into it, though, around 2018. I started really paying more attention to what was going on. This is right after the ICO mania of 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into a place called Node Worldwide in San Francisco, a little social club down on Columbus Avenue. And, there I just met so many people coming through and interviewed tons and tons of people during that time for podcasts and just for my own benefit and to help them with their pitches. And over time, what I found was I got involved in some of these different projects. And in fact, I even went to a hackathon for EOS. I don't know if you remember EOS.
I do. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I went there with a group of guys, and they had an idea, and I helped them, put it together, and they won the first prize and $100,000. I was
Wow.
like, I got a cut of that, which was cool. But that sort of got me into crypto, but it didn't convince me about Bitcoin at the time. One of the people in that group was a big proponent of Bitcoin, so I listened to him. And what I ended up doing was seeing over like the next 2 or 3 years, I would see projects come and go in the crypto space, and I would see kind of like behind the scenes of how they were, basically pushed out, and who had the most coin, right? Who minted the coin, and who had the most coin, and who had the most control. And I said, well, that doesn't look to me like the thing that I saw back at the beginning, which was TCP/IP, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the initial applications around the internet were mostly shared code that everyone had access to, and they could plug it into, their own systems, and they could build on top of it. And it's like, that's what Bitcoin looks like to me, right? That's Bitcoin. Bitcoin is shared code. It's people building a network. It's decentralized. No one person really has control over it. And because of that, it has well, at the time I knew it would have more resiliency. So it was probably around, let's say 2020, when the pandemic hit, that I just went completely into it, right? I just said, this is where it's going to be. I know this is going to be the thing that takes off. And so I ended up with a friend of mine who had helped me interview people back at Node Worldwide. He gave me a couple of these, these coin mine units. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're this consumer mining unit. And of course, it wasn't
For the Bitcoin blockchain or
yeah,
for
well, they
Ethereum?
said it was for mining currency, including Bitcoin, but it wasn't mining Bitcoin at all. It was mining something else.
Mm.
And they were, converting it into Bitcoin. Anyway, I set it up. And so I got a chance to really see what was going on and to capture the Satoshis that came out of it. And I made, a little bit of money. It didn't use up all of the electricity in the house, but it was pretty close. I mean, clearly I wasn't going to mine this forever. And eventually it was also clear that it was probably based on Ethereum, because when the ETH difficulty bomb came up, it immediately stopped working. So
A lot of those bombs tend to come up with the
right. So I
Ethereum
unplugged it
protocol.
and that's it. But that was the moment when I realized, okay, well, there are a couple of things going on there, right? First of all, I knew it was a decentralized system, and that part I think really resonated with me because I'd seen the power of that before, right? So that for me was a no-brainer. The second part of it was, if I were to build a business on top of something like Ethereum, it could get yanked away from me at any moment. Well, why would I do that, right? So then became, with those 2 points in mind, I was like, well, this is a no-brainer. And I've been on Bitcoin ever since.
So would you say when you first got into Bitcoin, or when you first started looking at the technology of blockchain and then ultimately settling on Bitcoin, were you looking at it more from a technology standpoint and kind of how to use your capital to necessarily take part in this network to grow wealth? Or did you see it as a form of unmanipulatable money in currency, the way some of the more I don't know, you call them, I guess, Bitcoin maximalists would consider Bitcoin today?
That's a really important place to go. And I would say that the main thing that was interesting to me was less the money and more the trust. So the network can create trust between people who do not trust each other. As somebody said, it was money for enemies, but I think that's it's a system that allows for trust between two parties that doesn't require a third party in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
That's a crucial technical advance that's been made through this network. And actually, I know something about this because I was a VP of marketing at Certicom, which is a cryptographic technology company that had started in the mid 80s, but towards the late 90s, we took advantage of the .com movement to build business around the use of elliptic curve cryptography inside of open protocols, basically SSL, to enable handheld devices to communicate with the mainline network for commerce, enterprise interactions, VPNs, that sort of thing.
So I want to stop you here because I love where you're going. But for some of our audience that might not be as technologically advanced, you used a couple acronyms that I think are important to kind of explain, like TCP and SSL, and some of those, just so people can follow along and not get.
Yeah, let me see if I can go there let's start with TCP/IP, right, which is a transmission control protocol, internet protocol. And this is a foundational layer for interactions between devices, between computers and systems on anything that was connected by a network. But it allows those devices to interact with it, to communicate with each other. Now, the communication is a pretty simple, pipe basically that it sets up between the two. And when you overlay that with other protocols, then you can create applications, you can create value on top of that open network.
So would you
So
say it's more of like a like telephone wires connecting two computers so two computers could talk to one another
yeah, well,
as a
actually,
base layer rudimentary?
so if you really want to go there, it's effectively when those first TCP/IP networks were set up, they were actually set up over telephone wires. So those trunks and all of the network that was in place had room for a data layer. Why
Okay.
did we need something that was specific to the requirements of data? Well, because there was a lot of overhead in the phone networks at the time, because it was designed for, and the design center was for voice calls. So it was very good, very reliable for voice calls, and very heavy weight for the data requirements. When
Mm-hmm.
you'd have a small packet that just you wanted to send out and then be dropped the packet, it would, you'd have to set up a session. It would take a long time. So, without going into the gory detail of educating everyone about that, I'll just say that, it's a fundamental technology that was different and unique from what was available at the time for the voice calls, but would actually be set up on that same network. So if you think about that.
Yeah, I think where I was hoping, and I'm excited about where you went with that, because that's kind of what I was trying to gather from that is when we think about the Bitcoin base layer blockchain network, it's incredibly
Exactly.
similar on the very rudimentary base layer, and everything gets built on top of that layer, similar to a spider web, and that's what makes it decentralized. Is you have many computers that are all connected to one another, so
Mm-hmm.
there's no one path for two computers to talk to one another. They can talk through several paths, and it really eliminates the ability for a centralized body, government, or foreign power to disrupt communications between inside the network.
Precisely. And actually, I'm really glad you went there, Chris, because there's a couple things that go into that. One, it's extremely resilient, right? I mean, I was at Sun Microsystems in 1989 when the earthquake hit, and I was in my office, and everything shook. This gigantic 19-inch color monitor moved like a foot across my desk. Power went out, and all the systems went down. As soon as the power came back up, the entire network rebuilt itself within 20 minutes, right?
Wow.
How does that happen? Well, it happens because it's a resilient system built on top of, a replicable system, right? So like all of these network nodes can figure each other out, and they can build a system and rebuild a system and in a very resilient way. And that is a really critical aspect of thinking about Bitcoin, because if you try to get rid of Bitcoin in one place, it will just move somewhere else, right? And there will be nodes all around the world. And so if you're China and you decide to crack down on Bitcoin, it's moving to Texas, okay? Or it's
Mm-hmm.
moving to Canada. If you decide in the US that we're going to crack down on Bitcoin, it's just going to move somewhere else, probably Africa, right? And then all we've done is accelerate the development of the African continent.
Yeah, it's been an incredibly watching the crackdown in China a year ago now, a year and a half ago now, when half of the network, half of the miners that were securing the blockchain were all immediately turned off, and the network kept running. Every 10 minutes, a new block was formed. And in Bitcoin, there's what's called a difficulty adjustment. So it takes into account how many people are mining for or competing for these new minted Bitcoin that create on average, 10 minutes. And every 2 weeks, it adjusts. So when more people are competing, the game becomes more difficult. And when less people are competing, the game becomes easier to keep everything in line and making sure that transactions are processed on average every 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And to see that happen in real time, and to have these FUD situations come up where they say, oh, well, that will allow for a 51% attack, and somebody could come in, some foreign power could come in and just buy up all those nodes and then own half the network and completely destroy Bitcoin. We didn't see that happen at all. what actually ended up happening is the next day, those miners were packed up and they were sold all over the world. And within weeks, those miners were turned back on, and the difficulty adjustment started to increase again, and the security of Bitcoin started to increase again. And I think one of the challenges we have as Bitcoiners when teaching others about Bitcoin is helping them understand the security protocols that are built into the system that go and that are played in the background that we don't even have to concern ourselves with because of the immense amount of human capital that's going into thinking about how to solve these problems, and then also the technology that's already available and plugged into the network that's literally solving these problems every day.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think what's amazing about the Bitcoin is the level of or the amount of forethought that went into the technology before it was developed and built out, and the network was grown at the very beginning. It didn't have to be changed, and still doesn't have to be changed. And that sort of thinking is, nothing. It's clearly someone took the time to go and put the intellectual thought into it, and possibly to have failed a few times. So we know Satoshi isn't doxed. It's not. We don't know who Satoshi is, but it has to be someone who's been in this industry for a while and who's tried out, or who's probably experimented with digital money back into the 80s, right? And if you can, there's a small group of people that all of them, claim that they're not the person, which is fine. But I'll just say this: it's very clear that whoever did put this thing together really had it thought through and has really come at it from a design center that was probably pre 2000. Really thinking about it. It wasn't like between 2000 and 2008 that this thing happened. This was somebody who was thinking about it well before that, who was really coming from the ethos of the distributed internet, right, and thinking about it from that perspective. And it's not a bad way to think about anything, because it's just highly resilient as a system, and the fact that we're taking our time to build it out isn't a problem. That's a design feature, not a bug, right? The pace of change is fine. Take your time and get it right. That's another thing that I actually really appreciate about it and value in it, is that it doesn't change so in such a crazy way. It's just there. It's resilient. But there's a lot. Once you have that, you can build so many things on top of it, which is why I'm very, very excited about the Lightning Network, and I'm paying a lot of attention to what's going on with that.
Yeah, similar to when the internet was first created. Maybe I'm a millennial, maybe I'm a Generation Xer. I'm kind of right there on the border. But my family had access to the internet pretty early on. And I remember being young, and really the only thing that you could find on the internet was message boards and news groups. And you had to dial in on your phone. And if you had any digital picture on your computer screen that was going to be downloaded, it would do it line by line, at 12K internet modem speed at the very beginning. It was
Right.
it was a funny process because not a lot of people were using it, but the people who were using it tended to have to be in the industry and were posting a lot of very specific things. And then fast forward, as more people got access to the internet and small businesses would start internet providing services in their local communities and then would sell those services out, the network started to grow. And the human hive mind started to kick in, and people started to realize, oh, well, this is a code software that anybody can learn how to write, similar to learning how to read,
Right.
which was HTML, and then started just building out from there. And then now we have what we have today, which back then was never supposed to amount to anything other than an overpriced fax machine, as some people in the finance industry have now eaten their words on. Um, but I don't want to spend too much more time on the technology side of it, because it's obvious Bitcoin is working. It is considered digital money at this stage. And so one of the things I'd like to talk about and get your perspective on is, as you were growing up, or as a young adult in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, as we were living through this financial turmoil of the bond market crash in the 80s, and then the NASDAQ crash in the early 2000s, and how interest rates played a role in your decision-making process on whether you were going to buy stocks, bonds, mutual funds at home, commodities, to grow wealth as you're starting a family, to start building for retirement, and then build that into where we're at today and how Bitcoin can be used as a portion of your portfolio to secure not just the wealth of your lifetime, but also generational wealth for the family.
Sure. I would say that I see as an investor, the advice. I have two adult children, so they're now 21 and 24. My oldest is a saver, and my youngest is not. I'll just leave it at that. My oldest has an IRA and a Roth IRA, and is putting away money each month. And the advice is put it into a total stock market, ETF kind of a thing, or some kind of fund that has very low fees, that just takes advantage of the growth in industry across the United States. If you believe that the United States is going to continue to be a driver of innovation and wealth and value creation, then by all means invest as much as you can in that and do dollar cost averaging. I wish I had done that from the very beginning, because I think it would be, I'd be in a better position now. I'm way more into like new technology, so I'm always going to like shiny object and invest in the next big thing. And the way I see Bitcoin fitting into my portfolio is that it is an asymmetric bet. I can put in about, let's say, 10% of my 10% of my portfolio is in some sort of Bitcoin related investment, whether it be, and by the way, this is kind of a boomer perspective, even though I'm on the cusp of boomer and Gen X, right there in 1961. I'm kind of right between those two. I see myself in some ways taking advantage of the boomer's perspective of put everything in your IRA and just let it ride. And so in my IRA, I have a mining stock, which is actually HUT, H-U-T. I don't know if anybody wants the stock pick, but I found them to be, I trust their management, and I trust their strategy of hodling, and I trust their low debt to equity ratio. I'm not completely 100% bought into their own transparency, but I think they're pretty good. I also have an investment in Block, which is Jack Dorsey's company that has Square and Cash App in it, and mostly because of their focus on the Lightning Network and Bitcoin in Cash App. And I think that Jack gets it, and not only does he get it, but he's going to be one of the few that is actually on the cutting edge of it. And he is a big enough organization that he can drive massive growth worldwide in a public stock. So I'm invested in them as well. And then I bought some GBTC. Now this was the kind of the mistake, is I looked at GBTC as an opportunity, but clearly that's, and we can talk about this. Clearly some shenanigans went on that have affected the price of that, that fund. That you wouldn't have been able to see because it wasn't as transparent, right? There were things that could affect it that weren't so obvious. So what I'm doing now is, in addition to those public investments, I'm taking more of a Gen X millennial view and starting to, millennial and Gen Z view, and starting to buy money for buy Bitcoin for cold storage. So I think that everyone should have some portion in cold storage, but I don't think you have to have the 100%. And so maybe that's, the old school guy in me, but I agree with both sides of that.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see the evolvement or evolution of the traditional finance system regarding retirement savings. Because when my grandparents, who were they're both deceased now, but when they were saving for retirement, they counted on the company. The idea that you go and work for a company for life was a very well-known American philosophy when going to work. And home values stayed fairly stable, and you just worked. And at the end of your working career, the company would then pay you back in the form of a pension for that. And then also it was at the start of the Social Security benefit that the government passed. But the marketing message that got lost with the Social Security was Social Security was never supposed to benefit you your entire life, or excuse me, your entire income. It wasn't to offset your entire income. It was only to offset 25% of your
Mm-hmm.
total income. You as a citizen were supposed to figure out the other 75% of how you were going to retire at whatever um, comfort level that you wanted, which
Mm-hmm.
typically ended being maybe a little bit of savings, a little bit of home equity, and the pension. And then in the 70s, 80s, the pensions kind of went by the wayside as companies started to grow and got over too big, and their pension portfolios started to get dipped into to pay off other things. And then they could no longer support paying off all of the people who, by all intents and purposes, were only supposed to live to 65. And now all of a sudden they're living much longer, which was a much bigger demand on those pension funds for much longer, which created a problem. So the IRA, or the 401 and 401k, SEP IRA, and those other products were ultimately invented as a way to give the corporations a little bit of to relax them and give them
Mm-hmm.
some ability to potentially pay off the rest of the pension holders that were in those. Like my
Sure.
grandpa, he retired from United Airlines in 1987, and he passed away 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's like 30 years
Yep.
right there, which
That's
is a
right
long
there.
time. And these pension funds were forced to invest the pool of money that was in them to generate at least an 8% return, which would ultimately be used to continue to be able to pay those things out. But during the 80s and the 90s, when interest rates went to 20% in the United States in the early 80s, since that point, interest rates have gone nothing but down, which have which has made it very difficult for pension funds and retirement funds and other types of retirement vehicles to really keep up with the demand that's going to be put on them when the individual gets into retirement. And so they were forced to leverage more and more of those dollars using financial instruments and derivatives and put options and call options and lever up those returns just so that they could basically stay even with the purchasing
Mm.
price of money. So, having said all of that, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on the concept of, yes, capital appreciation through investing in stocks and bonds for retirement, but also how the physical purchasing power of the unit of account you're going to be using, the dollar or Bitcoin or gold or whatever, how that plays into your decision-making process.
Yes, well, I understand from being engaged, more and more engaged in the Bitcoin community, that there is a strong emphasis on sound money and a real desire to see a return to sound money in the United States. And you can imagine that that's a very realistic perspective, um, because having lived through, you know, especially the last 20 years, but it's just felt like a really odd time in many ways, especially after the 2008, financial crisis, or it's a little bit longer than that, but it's that period of time. You can really see during that a a manipulation of the financial system that turns out to, you know, hopefully be in your advantage, but then possibly not, right? So let me unpack that a little bit. So at first, you have low, really low interest rates, right? Artificially low in many ways. And is that just because of the quantitative easing that came out of the Fed? Or is it the increase in globalization? So globalization became a very, very powerful trend in in those teens that we just went through. And China's source of, product became a very, very powerful manufacturing and other service economy. Uh, you have sources of energy coming from all over the world, and new energy coming online in the form of renewables. So you have like this beautiful Goldilocks scenario, right? Low inflation and low prices, or prices being held, but also relatively easy money for new investment in technology. The problem is, and this is where I'm beginning to understand the Bitcoin community's perspective on it, and this is the part that's really turning my mind towards a new way of thinking, right? And that is that the Cantillon effect is very strong when you have quantitative easing that goes directly into commercial banks who have very low risk, very high risk aversion. They will only put that money into the very highest possible returns for the least risk. And therefore, you saw a lot of investment in sort of basic property and in real estate and in commercial real estate, though, sort of big office towers and stuff. And you saw a bidding up of very strong blue chip assets. Now, for good or bad, that was fine. It actually didn't seem to grow as much as I would have expected it, but I did see firsthand a risk aversion in innovation. And I would say that if I were to go and spend more time in the next year or two just focusing on innovation, this is where I'd want to pull out what happened. Because what you see is investment in really big ideas, scale up ideas, which may or may not have actually created value in the overall economy, meaning being more productive and creating more productivity, which means higher value for everything, right? Outside of the cost of it. But what we've seen instead is that many of these things like Amazon just kind of eviscerated, the mom and pop stores in downtown, right? I mean, it's just what it did. It's okay. Google took away advertising money from your local newspaper. Media became much more, and then through Facebook and Google, then you have this advertising effect that just a few sources are where you have the bulk of the messaging, right? The messaging of what's going on in the world. And so over time, that broke down a lot of the community that we've had in the US. And that's, I think, a problem. And that's a problem that we're going to have to sort out very quickly. And we don't really have a choice but to kind of go through it quickly because of the sort of compounding of the political events. Now, this is as an older person looking at it, right? And having seen a different, worldview, and having gone through the decades of the world changing, and the US changing, you can see that happening. So again, I guess what I'm getting at is that as soon as then that point when the government started saying, well, we've got problems here, we're going to have to solve by spending money to resolve the social problems that were created by giving money to these big institutions and not really spending time to enforce monopoly law, that as a result, then we started spending a lot of money. We spent trillions of dollars. Obama started, then Trump, and now Biden. And we have now, 130% debt to GDP? That is a problem. That's created inflation. That plus deglobalization, China kind of stepping away from the global stage, lack of energy investment biting us. So you just go look around you. Inflation is going to be here for the next 10 years. That's going to be a real problem for seniors. They're going to have to keep working. I don't know any other way. And does Bitcoin solve this? That's the interesting question. Is Bitcoin the answer to this? It might be, and that's why I have it as an asymmetric bet in my portfolio.
Good answer. Good
answer. Long answer,
Yeah.
long answer, but I did get back to the original point there.
Yeah, I think ultimately the asymmetric bet is why a lot of us in Bitcoin are in Bitcoin. And it would seem, when somebody first steps into Bitcoin, they put their toes in the water. And in a lot of cases, it's not into Bitcoin, right? It's into other types of blockchain technologies that get a little bit more modern media airtime, and news articles in the Wall Street Journal and in Bloomberg and CNBC, because they're new, right? They're exciting. They're going to change the world. They're the thing it can't ever be the first thing is the best thing. It has to be iterations of the first thing into new variations on itself, and then ultimately you arrive at the best possible solution. When most don't realize that when Satoshi Nakamoto introduced Bitcoin to the world on October 31st, 2008, he had already taken all of those iterations and all of those technologies that had, like you had mentioned, been developed over the course of 30, if not 40 years,
Hmm.
and kind of perfected in their own right. He then married those technologies together and built some of the bridges and built and put together an all-encompassing solution to the double spend problem, or in modern terms, it's called the rehypothecation of money, where you give your bank $100 and that bank says you have $100 in your account, but then it loans that $100 out to somebody else.
Right.
So that dollar is basically accounted for twice, or in the US system, 10 times. So for every dollar that goes in, the bank gets to borrow or lend it out 10 times on the initial deposit. Another thing that you brought up that I think a lot of our guests or people listening will understand, the cotillion effect or Cantillon effect, but
Hmm.
many people who are older in life might not know that, because unless you're a student of money, it's not really a subject matter that comes up around the dinner table. And I kind of wanted to ask you a question on it. So the Cantillon effect is basically those who are closest to the money printer, or those who are the closest to the newly printed dollars, have first
Hmm.
access to it.
Right.
So what that means is they get that money first, which means they can then spend that money into the economy on, if you're a one percenter, it's new mansions, it's fancy cars, it's planes, it's boats, it's, evenings in Vegas. And there's zero appreciation or loss of purchasing power in that immediate dollar. Now, as that dollar transacts over and over again, as you buy the plane, and then the guy who built the plane then goes and buys bread at the store, and the guy who made the bread at the store then goes and buys wheat. As it moves further and further down the chain, inflation, that money is now further and deeper into the system, which creates a loss of purchasing power. And that's what we're seeing today with all the stimulus packages that were passed in early 2000, and how originally when they were passed, the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, kept coming out and saying, we're not seeing any signs of inflation. We're going to pump more money in. And they put in another $1 trillion. And then 6 months later, they said, we're not seeing any signs of inflation. We have much more room in our economy to help the downtrodden and the bottom rungs of society. So we're going to send them individual checks now for trillions of dollars worth of value.
Hmm.
And then here we fast forward 2 years. Now all of a sudden inflation is running at what they say 8%, but what we all know is probably much closer to 15 to 20%. And it's a
Right.
compounding thing. So this year's 8% plus next year's 8% becomes 16% in 2 years. And I don't know anybody who's making an 8% increase in their salary every single year. So we're all starting to fall further and further back, which is why they're trying to increase interest rates in the economy to pull the money back out of the market. But like a drug, once it's in there, you need more of it. You can't have less of it, otherwise you go through withdrawals. And in America, we have a tendency of not wanting to see those withdrawals happen to us. And it's the part of greed that's built into all of us, and greed can either be a good thing or a bad thing. Greed can either be used to benefit society, or it can be used to take away from society. And so, in conversations I've had a lot with full circle now, to come back to my question for you, um, a lot of the older people in life that I talk to about the current state of the economy and the market and purchasing power and home price appreciation is, they know it's not going to last forever, but the bet is that it will at least last their lifetime. So whatever's on the back side of this to come, it will happen after they're gone. Do you hear similar conversations about that? Am I crazy? Is it just my father who thinks that way?
It might be your father. I would say that I'm looking through the generations that are in my family, and my parents and in-laws. They're looking at this as they have their investments, they have their houses, they mostly have fixed property tax. Um, they have very little demand in terms of things they want to buy, right? So the main thing is just food and energy, right? And if your house is already paid for and you have a steady income from a number of sources, they're not in distress. People in my age are mostly in good shape. People like 10 years after are starting to have you're starting to see a lot of stress because many of them don't have their own home. They might be renting. They might have been kicked. They might have lost their homes in one of the, especially the 2008 crisis, but in any one of the many multiple crises we've had. And so when you are in that situation, you are at the you're at the mercy of the change in the price of property, basically, of those things you have to buy, like energy, like a place to live, shelter, and food. Those are the main things, right? So if food's going up, if the shelter's all going up because the Cantillon effect has basically, let's actually step back here and talk about that, right? Cantillon effect is if you're standing close to the spigot, then you have more access to the money. Let's actually be really, really precise about what that means in the United States in this, in the last 20 years. After the financial crisis, the rules changed, and the Fed, hoping to save the economy, which is a world economy, by the way. Most of the problem was actually a Eurodollar problem. The Eurodollar, trillions of dollars that were offshore that are basically created out of nothing, right? So the bulk of this problem is actually, a global economy that drove it. But what that caused the United States to do was this QE-ish thing, which is really just changing interest rates and doing balance sheet adjustments to put more money into the commercial banks to keep the few commercial banks that were left, to keep them afloat. Those commercial banks, being very risk averse, put that money into the economy in places where there was less risk. So mostly into property, right? Which then shored up property values, which is, good if you had a property and you needed to move. But over time, that money started slipping into other areas, right? So they're chasing yield, and they give it to certain people to now invest on big scale. And that scale did not allow innovation to happen. And so my concern and where I come from is a place of innovation. So I see the investments going into less risk averse, so less risk taking. And that risk aversion has led to the inflation that we have today. And let's take like the different aspects of that inflation. Let's take energy. Energy investment has been very, very low because we've been trying to wean ourselves off of primarily carbon sources, because we do have a climate change issue. As an adult leaving the earth to my kids and to their generation, it's a problem. It's a real issue. You can see it, and it potentially affects food. But we'll get to that in a second. So start with the energy cost, right? So energy costs create a big aspect of your food costs and your your basic living. Property values have all been accelerating because of the low interest rates allowed people to put the money they had extracted into some investment and then lever up the cost of it. Well, that chases property tax rates go up. Your neighbor's property is more valuable, which means your property is more valuable, and now you're probably going to pay higher property tax, unless you're in California, because we capped it, which is good for my mother-in-law. But what I'm getting at is that those are two sources of inflation. Let's take a third. So energy, property values. Now let's look at global supply chains, right? Global supply chains benefited from the investment that China made in capitalism. And China is now off of that chain. They're now said, well, we did this so that we could create a socialist environment where we could distribute. Now they can distribute the value that they've created, which is great. They created a lot of value, but now they're cracking down on that and they're distributing it. So that's not increasing the value in the world. That's just redistributing it inside China, and it creates a further cost increase on, goods and services throughout the world, and particularly in the United States. So there's three, right? So if you think about it, that's three inflationary forces that we didn't have before. And I take the fourth one, which is that we have not invested in as much innovation as we needed to, because we've just been basically grabbing money from one side of the economy and putting it in the hands of another side, which is just a transfer. So we have to go back. So if you think about it, think about all that. We should not be cracking down on demand right now, and we should not and reducing supply. We should actually be finding ways to get money into the hands of true innovators. It may be that through this, we actually do benefit from the fact that the Cantillon effect gets shut down because there's less money going into the risk-averse players, and more money will then go into the hands of the strong operators who create gross profits. And those companies that create gross profits will then invest in the next generation of value. So they use it to create new markets, new opportunities. So that's how I see it playing out. And from my perspective as a person who has to deal with increasing costs, just means I'm going to have to keep working for a while, so.
On that topic, what products does Bitcoin need to solve some of those issues that you've talked about? What does the economy need? What's the new technology, the new innovation that needs to help these people who are later in life adopt Bitcoin and start bringing it in as a safety net, a potential asymmetric trade, an insurance to be able to outlive their money?
Yeah. So if I would say that the thing that I'm looking at for myself, and what has me really excited right now, is the Lightning Network that's being built out on top of Bitcoin. So if hopefully your viewers will be aware of it, or at least they'll start to look into this. But the Lightning Network is a system of nodes, a network of nodes that take Bitcoin as collateral and use it to create channels for very fast payments. So if anyone tells you, well, Bitcoin can't be used for payments, you're like, well, that's true. As a layer one, it's not intended for that. But the layer two Lightning Network that uses Bitcoin as collateral, right, to enable trust between parties, that network can provide access to, or for payments that process instantly, and that can be executed across borders between people who don't really trust each other. And that is a major. Lightning Network is probably the biggest, craziest, most important disruptive innovation that's going to happen in my lifetime, possibly. And that includes the internet, right? But of course, it's based on the internet, and it's based on all this technology, and these are the layers. But the fact that you can basically eliminate the third parties in financial transactions is just an extraordinary innovation that leads to improve living standards. It leads to the lifting up of marginalized people. I don't know if you have spent any time, but I'm starting to read about the unbanked and the underbanked, because you can see people that my kids have grown up with. They're kind of in that place where they're looking at it like, I don't need a bank and I can't afford a bank anyway, so I'm going to use this financial services platform. And I think that's kind of the direction that we're going to start seeing things go, and that is a major innovation. Now, the thing that comes out of that I'm actually looking at as well, it kind of goes back to my time working at Certicom. I mentioned this briefly, but during that time, I was in a company. I was heading up the marketing for it, and we were looking at new opportunities for how to use cryptographic technology. And my feeling was that the next step for the internet would be to have identity that we all owned, right? That we all controlled our own identity. And you could be sure that your identity was protected in this situation, right? Because it's only yours. And that you would share only that information that you needed to share with the institutions around you. Some form of credential. I'm over 21. I'm under 65. I'm over 65. I have this much money that I can use in this transaction, right? This is my credit, right? This is not just my credit. This is exactly how much money I have that's liquid, right? And
Mhm.
so you can share that with people without sharing all of your identity. There's no reason that I have to be telling everybody exactly who I am, because all that information goes into some database somewhere that gets hacked because they don't spend an appropriate amount of time to protect it. That should be criminalized, by the way. And, any company that allows your information to be released like that because of their negligence, there should be massive lawsuits against them, or they just should send those people to jail, because that is the most criminal thing, to put someone at risk of their whole life because you know you didn't take the time or energy to protect their personal information. So that, to me, the idea of decentralized identity, verified credentials, that needs to happen on top of Bitcoin, and it will happen in the same way that the Lightning Network has happened. And I can predict that within the next 5 years, you'll see that.
Yeah, there's a company, I don't know if you've heard of it, called Impervious,
Mm.
and they're working on that exact problem with only allowing the portions of your identity that are necessary in order to transact to actually be accessible and used while online. And right now they're doing it through a web browser, as far as I know. But yeah, you should check them out. They're one of the there's a venture company called Tremel, and all they do is invest
Tremel Ventures.
in,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, Bitcoin only
Yep.
technologies. And one of my buddies is an investor in that, and so he tells me about some of the companies that they're investing in. And I've actually met one of the founders of that company at last year's Orange County Bitcoin Christmas party, which was kind of cool. So
That's very
yeah,
cool.
definitely
No,
check
I
them out.
appreciate that. I'll after this interview, we'll follow up, because I'm super excited about those kinds of technologies.
Yeah, and revolving around the unbanked, my wife and I, we created our second Bitcoin book is called 99 Signs You Might Be a Bitcoin Maximalist. And the first page is sign one is you've read the Bitcoin white paper, and then we have a meme that goes along with it. And the meme basically says, I don't always send money to Nigeria, but when I do, I send Bitcoin. Um,
That one I love. I love that.
because the African continent is one of the most unbanked continents on the world or in the world, and it really creates a lot of friction for anybody who's a citizen of Africa to create any sort of wealth at all in the country or the countries, the continent. And so technologies like Bitcoin and a company like Strike, if you're familiar with them, with Jack Mallers, he just released some stuff today, actually, saying that he's made some connections with a couple of African uh, countries that are going to allow for Strike integration into their economies. And for those who don't know, Strike is a Lightning Network Bitcoin company that uses Bitcoin rails, Lightning rails,
Mhm.
but to the consumer, to the user, all you see on your interface is dollars or whatever local currency that you use.
Mhm.
So it's a way to send money to family, friends, other businesses anywhere in the world without having to pay the exorbitant amount of banking fees that the traditional finance and banking industry charges through the SWIFT network. And so it's allowing families to work abroad, and then rather than going down to Western Union or down to their local bank and create MoneyGrams and sending them down and paying anywhere between 1 to 15% of that money to get it to their families. Now they can, and for it to take a week at a time, now they can send that money almost instantly anywhere in the world at almost zero cost. So it's
Right.
really changing the way people in these third world countries are able to think about money and think about their futures. My wife and I, we had a chance to go down to El Salvador in April of last year, and we heard story after story of people who were living in one town, but that town didn't have a bank in it, and so they'd have to get on a bus and travel halfway across the country to go to the closest bank or Western Union facility or MoneyGram facility to pick up that weekly check from their child or spouse or other family member in a different country just so they would have enough money that week to live. And now with technologies like Lightning, their families are able to send them money in real time that is stored on a cryptographically secured and safe app on their phone, where they can then transact and go to the grocery store and buy their groceries, or pay other services and vendors and accept other services. They're actually able to start businesses now because they don't have the liability of holding physical cash with them that can be stolen from them or lost. So it really is beginning to, just this one technology is starting to help the poorest in the world realize that they can finally come up and create value for their families and for their future generations. It's very
Yeah.
exciting stuff.
Yeah, and what's interesting about it is that we as Americans don't really recognize it very much. We just don't see it because we live a very privileged life in many ways. By having just enough money to have a banking service, we're doing pretty well. But what's interesting about it is that we're starting to see the next generation struggling a little bit with it. And just as we have, just people living around the world that are in great abject poverty, we have people right here in the US living the same kind of life or getting close to it. And it's hard for them here because everything's so expensive, right? So if everything around you becomes expensive, it doesn't matter how much you make relative to someone in the rest of the world. If it's just 10x more expensive just to buy your basic food, well, then it doesn't seem like, you seem kind of poor. So I think it's these technologies that we're talking about, they're going to benefit people here in the US just as much as they are going to benefit people around the world. And we have to look at it from the context of the open, resilient network that is being built in Bitcoin will then be a foundation, and which, by the way, is built on the open, resilient network of the internet. That will then create another layer of open, resilient protocols for the basics around trust, and that will blow away. It will just blow away problems left, right, and center. And organizations and institutions that feel like they need to try to control this, they're not going to be able to. Period. I watched this happen. Again, I watched this happen firsthand with the TCP/IP network. There were plenty of people who were competing against us trying to stop it, and they had no chance because it's a technology that really needed to exist because it's provided value to so many people. It created value. And I'm going to come back to this because I know we're probably going to run out of time here. But the thing that I do for people is to help them create value. My goal is to listen to what they're doing and say, where are the unmet needs that you're satisfying? Where is the thing that's happening? What can you do in the world that no one else can do that unlocks value? Because I can guarantee you that's going to happen. You're going to immediately make money in that space, right? If you have a decent product, you're immediately going to be successful. And that money that you make by the creation of that value will then fuel all the next, set of features that you put into it and help you to grow. And that one kind of concept for me is super, super important. And that, I think, is the positive takeaway that I have around Bitcoin is just the foundation that it provides for that creation of value.
Fantastic. Yeah, before we end this, there are two more topics I want to touch on.
Go for it.
The first one is, do you have a favorite orange pilling story? Like, is it an individual that you've tried a long time to orange pill and finally succeeded? Or was it somebody who you never thought would be involved in Bitcoin and they were one of the first people for you to orange pill?
I would say that I haven't really gotten to that place where I have a definitive one. I have irons in the fire right now. So let's leave that, because I think what's happened is that the people that I've been talking to are coming around slowly. They're not arguing with me. They're listening now. So let's just take it as this is my first step along the way, is just to get them to listen.
Okay, great. And then the next question then would be, one of the challenges I've discovered people have with Bitcoin is getting comfortable with buying it, holding it, storing it. What are some pieces of advice or some places you would tell people to go to begin the process of acquiring Bitcoin and then how to store it properly?
Right. So we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. I think for people who are a little older who have an IRA or some form of retirement account, uh, it's okay to buy it. Maybe not GBTC, but it's okay to buy a mining company if it has low debt to equity. Um, and
There are not very many of those around right now.
not very many. I think Riot and Hut, if you go and look at it, those are two good ones. But there's some risk in that, right? Because there may be other issues that they run into along the way. But after that, after you bet on something that's aligned with Bitcoin to some extent, then to buy it for yourself, then you have this discussion about whether you do KYC or non-KYC. And I'm assuming that people aren't here buying a miner and mining their own, because that actually could still be viable for some people. If you buy a miner and what is it? Compass is still available, right? Compass is still out there, lets you put your miner in their network and use their pool. That's a possibility to mine your own Bitcoin. But most people are going to basically buy it on an exchange somewhere, and they should immediately take it off and put it into some form of cold storage. So I have a Trezor wallet. I don't know if that's the best one, but it's A1, and I can take my sats and put them onto the Trezor wallet and put it into a vault in the house that's fireproof. So
Yeah, yeah,
that probably thing. I will say though, that's not trivial. This is the part of the problem, is that takes some bit of time and energy and thought on my side to go through all the steps. And if I try to do a non-KYC, right, so that I run, if you have a KYC, you run the risk of confiscation from the government. Government's already come through, confiscate gold at different times because it wanted to go off the gold standard, right? So
yeah.
it basically confiscated U.S. citizens' gold. That could happen with Bitcoin. Bitcoin could be shut down for a number of reasons. So I think there's a combination of KYC and non-KYC that some people will take on as an opportunity. I don't know if it makes that much sense for me. I'd probably just go KYC and KYC being know your customer, right? So you have to put your name in and associate it with you when you go to exchange your dollars for Bitcoin to be stored. But in the future, look, if Bitcoin's going to do what we think it's going to do, I'm going to argue that the most likely scenario is that the US dollar will still be in place and Bitcoin will still be in place, and both will have their uses.
Yeah, that's kind of been my thought on Bitcoin too. I think that people who think that Bitcoin's just going to take over the world and there's not going to be any fiat currencies, and I think it's the real answer is no. There'll still be local currencies just like there are today, but what it'll come down to is rather than going to the airport or going down to your bank and having to pay the exchange fees from changing one currency into another, which can be costly. You can take your Bitcoin or you can take your fiat currency or your US dollars or euro or won or yen or whatever, and you can transfer those into a digital realm, which in this case would be Bitcoin, at really no fee whatsoever. And then you travel wherever you want to in the world. And then when you get to wherever you are, then you take that Bitcoin and you transfer it back into the local currency at no fee and then transact with it as you will. I think that's the earliest path of adoption for Bitcoin. Um, Maybe at some point, if the doom and gloomers will say that the financial calamity will occur in the next 10 years and all the sovereign nations with all the debt loads that they have will completely explode, and they'll need to have a global organization create some sort of Fed coin or larger and basically bail out the world, and then you have one global currency.
Yeah.
But even in that case, it sounds like it might be a centralized digital currency or a CBDC, a central bank digital currency of some sort, which then falls into its own category of centralization and regulation and
Right.
all
And
of.
all of that, all of what you said. Like the U.S. is a resilient economy based up of what 340 million, citizens who are all have quite a bit of freedom and a rule of law. And to the extent that we can hold on to that through this crisis period that we're in at the moment, and we come out the other side with those things intact, then it will just continue to chunk forward, especially if we can open ourselves up to value creation as opposed to value transfer. Right now, value transfer is dominant. That needs to stop and slow down, and it will, because we just don't have the money. We'll have too much debt. So there will be a time when the U.S. just has to stop spending, and the coin will still be useful, but I don't think they can control the world's economy as bankers have thought they will, because they just won't have the power. Meanwhile, I would not be surprised at all if there was some form of interbank transfer globally that was based on Bitcoin, the sound money international bank transfers, and then individuals holding Bitcoin for their, as collateral could be using it to invest in pools for trusted peer-to-peer activity, peer-to-peer payments, peer-to-peer trust, et cetera. So yeah, I'm fully optimistic about the long-term play on this, and but at the same time, very concerned about the short term. I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding, and I'm hoping, Chris, that this is, one aspect of, how we start to educate our friends and and our colleagues and our compatriots in arms as U.S. citizens and beyond, and world citizens, that we could all kind of get to an understanding that the sound money is the real issue here, and the need to put something of value into the world is what we're here to do, to create the value. And we really need to be working with each other to do that, not to transfer from one side to another.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the main parts I hope people get out of these interviews, that I hope to be doing a lot more of, isn't necessarily that I'm here pushing Bitcoin and saying Bitcoin is already the answer and anybody who's not buying it just doesn't understand it. Because the reality is two people like you and I, from different generations, living different lives, different experiences, have somehow in some way come towards the idea that Bitcoin might be the solution to the problems that we're asking ourselves on how are we going to navigate this difficult time ahead. And we don't have all the answers, but we do enjoy asking the questions of one another and getting those ideas and creating new rabbit hole ideas that then we can go research more and see if it is the right choice for our family or the wrong choice. And so I hope that that's at the end. And then at the end of the day, you make your own decision. This is not a financial show. We talk about financial stuff, but do your own due diligence and talk to a financial advisor and get as many people's perspective in this as possible.
Yeah.
And
now,
with that,
Chris, are you in the Bay Area still, right?
No, I'm in Orange County.
Orange County. Okay.
Southern California. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, maybe sometime we can do a panel with some other people of advanced years and see if we can get some blistering conversation going.
That would be great. Yeah, I have another couple of interviews set up here, so I hope to be creating a network and helping everybody kind of connect with one another.
That'd be cool.
Probably a good time to wrap it up here. Do you have any final thoughts, or how do people follow you on?
Yeah, so a couple things. You can follow me at Stewart Noyce on Twitter. I am more active now. I had kind of gone into hibernation on Twitter, but with my interest in Bitcoin, I'm getting back into it because it's a great place to interact with people in a space like this. I have a blog at stewartnoyce.com, and I have a business at truenorth.com, trunorth.com. And I provide services for product marketing and especially for people who are innovators, who are thinking about and creating the future. I have a whole process for getting you through to the end and helping you through the various points in time where things can get choppy.
Well, great. Thanks for being on the show, Stewart. Everybody, this is Wisdom Through Bitcoin. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and see you next time.